This is Optimal Relationships Daily, episode 1823. What Does It Mean to Be a Neighbor? By Frederick of Here.life. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of ORD on this fine Saturday. I'm your host and narrator, Greg Audino, this time reading an article for you that I can say with great confidence discusses relationships that we have not discussed before, those being the relationships that we have with our neighbors. These relationships ought not to be forgotten, even though they often are. So let's learn today about how we can cultivate them as we optimize your life. What Does It Mean to Be a Neighbor? By Frederick of Here.life. When our now teenage daughter was 10 years old, she was walking our dog and noticed that a neighbor's car was broken into. Shattered glass was on the ground, and papers from the car were scattered about the street. She knocked on the door, but no one was home. She collected the papers, clipped them together, and left a note for the neighbors, describing the situation. She also left them her giving money, $20 at the time, as a contribution towards fixing the broken car window. Our neighbors were touched by the thoughtfulness, returned our daughter's donation, and wrote a thank you note back to her. Our daughter behaved like a good neighbor, and our family made new friends a few doors down. For decades, Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers, created a platform to remind kids, but really all of us, the power of kindness. He invited people to become part of his neighborhood by asking, "Won't you be my neighbor?" Nearly all of us are neighbors, i.e., we live adjacent or physically close to others. But not many of us are necessarily good neighbors. It's an unfortunate reality for our neighbors, but also for us. Research indicates that knowing your neighbors reduces loneliness, increases trust, and elevates overall well-being. So, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? Step 1 for becoming a good neighbor is to actually know your neighbor. By this measure, there is significant room for improvement. According to research from the Pew Research Center, only about a quarter of people living in cities and suburbs profess to know all or most of their neighbors. For older adults, according to a recent study, nearly half report to know few or none of their neighbors. A clear relationship exists between loneliness among midlife and older adults and connections with their neighbors. Only 25% of those who know most or all of their neighbors are lonely, as compared to 64% of those who know none of them. Good neighbors are also more trusting of their neighbors. About 2/3 of people who know their neighbors would trust their neighbors with their house keys. Interestingly, older and wealthier people are more likely to trust neighbors who they know. Being a good neighbor helps our overall well-being too. A study found that people who felt connected to their neighbors had significantly fewer strokes than those who felt alienated. Researchers found the difference to be similar to that of a current smoker, as compared to someone who has never smoked. It's unrealistic for most of us to be best friends with our neighbors. In our modern era, our social circles are often too large, and our lives too busy to have our social circles revolve around our neighbors the way it did generations ago. But getting to know our immediate neighbors shouldn't be too much of a chore. What can be done to facilitate being a good neighbor? Some of the responsibility falls on each of us. We have to make time and take the initiative to introduce ourselves. Bringing cookies doesn't hurt either. Research indicates that just introducing yourself to someone you don't know generally improves the self-reported well-being of both parties. Odds are your neighbor may just be a friend you haven't met yet. Institutions can also play a part. I have a friend in Richmond whose church surveyed the congregation and found that few knew the names of their neighbors. Far fewer knew anything of personal substance about their neighbors. They were falling short on the biblical principle of loving your neighbor. In response, the church launched a challenge to the congregation to get to know their neighbors. Partially as a result, my friend and her daughters now have an adopted grandmother next door. They made the effort, and all have been rewarded. The design of our places can help too. New urbanism, for example, promotes sidewalks, front porches, and bike lanes to promote interaction among residents of a community. Third places, such as parks and green spaces, libraries and community pools, can also provide opportunities for regular neighbor interaction. The WHO, World Health Organization, and AARP are helping educate urban planners on ways to make our places work better for people of all ages. We found neighborhood schools to be a particularly effective way to get to know those around us. It's even been helpful to get to know older neighbors, as there are ample opportunities for people of all ages to volunteer, including as judges for school projects. Apartments, given their density of residents, can be a particularly ripe opportunity for cultivating good neighbors. We found this at the Stories at Congressional Plaza, where creating a friendly culture was a clear benefit. We recently moved to Austin from Baltimore, and frankly, I haven't been a very good neighbor. We're renting a house before we move into a permanent home this summer, and I haven't made the effort of introducing myself. Fortunately, I'm surrounded by some good neighbors. The neighbor to our left, Colleen, is a longtime resident, and she introduced herself to us. She also alerted us to a pending problem with our sewer. It's possible that she didn't need to read the research to understand that making a connection was important to both of our well-being. You just listened to the post titled, "What Does It Mean to Be a Good Neighbor?" by Ryan Frederick of Here.life. And thanks a lot to Ryan for this post, a really great one, needless to say, and one that helps us to be more conscious neighbors, of course. It actually reminds me of something I did once in college that I have been meaning to do again since I just moved into my newest place. Basically, I went through the hallways in my dorm along with my roommates, and we slipped a paper under each door telling everyone who we were, which number dorm was ours, and to come over anytime to visit or call us if they needed anything. We were pretty social kids, so, this wasn't off-brand for us. Though, in retrospect, I'm sure at least part of the reason we did this was because we figured it would be a wholesome tactic for meeting girls. But I digress. It's definitely a simple and kind gesture that I would like to implement now as an adult as well, and perhaps this episode gave me the kick I needed to actually go out and do it, instead of just talking about it. Maybe it inspires you to do the same. Theoretically, that's what all these episodes should be about. But that's going to bring us to the end for today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this post as much as I did, and that you are rethinking what it means to be a good neighbor, as well as the benefits that it could yield for you and your community. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow, where your optimal life awaits.